Welcome to another of our reflections on the New Testament book of Ephesians as we venture forward in chapter 2. Now, if you've been following these in order, which as ever I really do recommend that you do, then as we read forward from verse 11, you're going to be hearing some very familiar phrases and structures because as ever, Paul is constantly connecting each element of what he has to say to a lot of what has gone before. So you're going to hear that familiar refrain that you used to be this, but now you're that, which we heard in the first part of the chapter. And that, of course, builds on this whole idea of being in Ephesus, the everyday world of our life experience, and in Christ, the identity which we have been granted through our faith, which in turn shapes our perspectives and our understanding of the world around us. We're going to hear Paul debunking some more of those ideas that he would have been totally committed to in his former life as a Pharisee, speaking of how our identity in Christ generates a whole new understanding of our relationship with God, and indeed who else can now be included in that relationship. But for all that may be true, what Paul is not doing is simply going around in the same old circles saying the same old things like a preacher who's run out of things to say but hasn't run out of time in which to say it yet. As ever, Paul is taking his argument forward. We've already noted that chapter 2 begins to apply some of those big concepts in chapter 1 to our everyday behaviour and attitude, and he particularly continues that thread here through its implications, particularly for issues of peace and reconciliation. And in a world that seems increasingly divided and at odds with itself, I sense that many of us would welcome some wise insights into issues of peace and reconciliation. So let's take a look at what he has to say as we read together Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 to 19. Therefore, remember that formerly you were Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcised, which is done in the body by human hands. Remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel and foreigners to the covenants of promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who were far away, and peace to those who were near. For through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit. And here we hear Paul again echoing so much of what Jesus achieved and accomplished through his death on the cross. And this is another narrative that broadly falls into three sections. Firstly, verses 11 to 13, about moving from being distant from God to being near. And then he talks about being at peace with God in verses 14 to 17, which in turn leads us to reflect on being at peace with one another, through those who were previously divided, being brought into one community in Christ, or into one humanity, as Paul puts it here. And while that clearly needs some unpacking and explaining, I sense that there are some key principles that even now we would do well to just restate. I think the first thing is to notice how central the death of Jesus is in all of this. Look at how he speaks of Christ in the flesh, Christ's blood being shed. The death and resurrection of Jesus remains central to Paul's understanding of things. And then we see some interesting perspectives on this whole issue of peace. I doubt if there is anyone who would not express a desire that we as human beings were better at living in peace with each other. And what Paul reminds us of here is that our peace with one another is rooted in our peace with God. And our peace with God is rooted in our relationship with God, in being drawn near to God. And the profound conclusion of these verses is that everyone is invited to draw near to God. Yes, everyone, says Paul. That is what the death and resurrection of Jesus has accomplished. It has opened the door of God's kingdom to absolutely everyone. Now, those of you who are regulars to these reflections will know that I have made quite a thing of Paul's former life as a Pharisee, a group of highly religious, deeply committed followers of God's law. And I've admitted more than once that something that defined people a couple of thousand years ago may not feel terribly relevant in our world today. But as we start to think about this issue of peace, I want to suggest that it once again has something quite significant and profound to say to us. You see, there are many people in our world who would really struggle with what's going on here in Paul's writing. For an overtly religious book, written by an overtly religious writer, to speak about peace could feel like total nonsense, because many might say that religion, both now and in the past, is more a source of conflict than of peace. And that's not an entirely unjustified point of view. There are many examples of violence and conflict in our world that can trace their roots in one way or another to religious differences. Isn't Paul just the best being naive, or at worst downright deceptive, when he speaks of being at peace with one another through Christ? And we could even dip back into Acts chapter 18, which contains the historic accounts of Paul's original visit to Ephesus, and point out that there was a fair bit of religious violence going on there at the time. You got the story of a riot when the religious traders fell out with Paul because he was damaging their business prospects. You've got some of his fellow Jews falling out with him and publicly maligning him. Hardly a peace-filled stay, we might say. So we might argue that in a couple of thousand years, very little has changed. So how come Paul is so adamant that Christ brings peace? Well, for one thing, I would want to argue that a lot of so-called religious conflict in our world is actually more a matter of people who had already fallen out with each other, just using religion as an easy hook on which to hang their differences. But that certainly doesn't account for all of them. And I sense that Paul's life experience as a Pharisee helps him to distinguish between religion and being in Christ. Now again, we might be inclined to say, Phil, you're talking nonsense here. Those two things are one in the same. And yes, they can be. Our being in Christ is a religious identity. But sometimes religion, if used and understood the wrong way, can actually distort our understanding of Christ. And Paul knew that, because when he was a fully signed up Pharisee, he had a very different view of Christ than the one that he expounds in the book of Ephesians. Paul was never an irreligious or unreligious person, but his view of Christ and his understanding of who God was through Christ are very, very different. But let's take that even further, to think about the underlying mindset that Paul had that led him to these very negative views about Jesus and his followers. When Paul was merely religious, he very much saw his religion as the thing that divided him from other people. In fact, devout followers of his faith would often describe God's law and their adherence to it as a wall or a hedge that kept them in and others out. And when we recognise that, we suddenly see the significance of the text of verses 14 and 15. He has destroyed the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law with its commands and regulations, says Paul. And it may be important to recognise what Paul is saying and what Paul is not saying here. He's not saying that God's law is obsolete and no longer valid, but what he is saying is that our alignment with God's purposes expressed through God's laws is no longer achieved through external ritual and regulation, but heartfelt relationship. And that's where all this stuff about circumcision and uncircumcision comes in. And before it all gets a bit too squeamish, it might be helpful for us to recognise that this was quite a common phrase that would have been used by Jews at the time to distinguish themselves from Gentiles. And whatever we might make of it, they saw it as a sign of their superiority and somehow attracting God's favour. So here's that division narrative again. And the now Christian Paul just dismisses it. He says, look, it's just an external ritual, a human activity done by human beings. What matters is what it represents. A genuine and heartfelt relationship with God and with anyone else who shares that relationship, irrespective of what external rituals they may or may not have gone through. It's through Christ, it's through what Christ has done in his flesh and on the cross that we are brought near to God. Not through our heritage, not through our pedigree, not through what we do or don't do to our bodies or our knowledge of religious ritual. Without Christ, there is no church, says Paul. Now, it's easy for us to kind of point the finger at that synagogue congregation in Ephesus and say, well, there you go, you can't keep us out. You can't tell us that we don't belong. But I think we can all fall victim to making our religious identity out to be more than it should be, to see it as distinguishing us from others, and yes, even we can see it as a way of defining who's in and who's out. And Paul has said a lot here about what Christ has done. He's saved us. He's released God's grace on us. He's seated us in the heavenly realms, and so I could go on. But we are called to be followers of Jesus, people living in relationship with Christ, not people who sign up to the benefits that Paul's listed here. Can you see the point that I'm making? We're not in relationship with those blessings, we're in relationship with Jesus. As one writer put it, we can't claim the gifts without recognizing the giver. And the theological reality that Paul has so powerfully outlined here needs to be the lived reality in our lives today as Christian believers. Let me explain what I mean by that. Paul has quite clearly spoken here of the death and the resurrection of Jesus. He makes a number of references to it in the reading that we've just shared. And he's spoken of how through that Jesus has broken down the walls of division between us and each other and between us and our God. Like I said, there is no church without Christ. But just as there is no church without those timeless historic acts of Jesus, there is no church today without the living presence of Jesus. We may come together around a set of prescribed rituals and beliefs. We may be able to faithfully reproduce the activities and the actions that previous generations of Christians have undertaken. But if that's all there is to us, then whatever we are, we're not an authentic church community. The whole point of these verses is that it isn't external ritual or following a set of prescribed regulations. What makes us the church is that we are a community that is centered on Christ, a community in living relationship with Christ, a people who place our relationship with Christ over and above our relationship with the gifts and benefits that Christ bestows on us. So maybe that's the first question that you might want to consider as you look at these verses either on your own or with other people. How do we stay centered on Christ? Are there aspects of our tradition, our routines, our beliefs, our practices that have become more important to us than our relationship with the risen Jesus? How do we make sure we keep Christ central, both in our individual lives and in our life as a Christian community? How do we make sure that anything that we might describe as religious always takes second place to our relationship with Jesus? Because, as I said, peace with each other, peace in our world, begins by us drawing near and finding peace with God. But as we draw near and recognize that, I want to invite you to pause and just think about what a profound idea that would have been when Paul first began to talk about it. Now, let me try and explain that by inviting you to take a look at this verse from the writing of the prophet Isaiah. He had a very real experience of being drawn near to God when he was in the temple. And this was his response: "Woe to me, for I'm ruined. I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." And even in the New Testament, when Peter had one of those moments of realization of who Jesus truly was after witnessing an amazing miracle, he announces, "Get away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man." It's fascinating, isn't it, that people's first response in the Old Testament, in the pre-Jesus death and resurrection period of time, when they made themselves aware of being in God's presence, that wasn't a peaceful moment. It was a disturbing moment, because they recognized in the light of God's holiness their own shortcomings. They saw that wall that stood between them and God, and they were afraid that they may have stepped through it. But Jesus, says Paul, has destroyed that wall of hostility, as he puts it. The natural reaction to being drawn near to God may have once been to cower in fear, maybe to be afraid for your very life. But when we recognize the riches of God's grace rather than the extent of our own shortcomings, in Christ, through Christ, that understanding and experience is transformed. We find peace because Christ has made peace with us through the cross. And for me, that raises another question. How can we therefore be a community that is drawn and draws others nearer to God? And this again is going to be a big theme throughout the rest of Ephesians. And again, the contrast between Paul's previous religious experience and his now found faith in Jesus is that he now sees his religious identity not as something to push others away, but to draw them near. Not something that draws the lines of division, but creates the bonds of unity. And of course, as we are drawn closer to God, we are drawn closer to each other. And yes, Paul's understanding of who he was in Christ, and indeed who he was when he was not part of Christ's community, changes from him seeing himself as different to others, Jews or Gentiles, to recognizing what he had in common with everyone, whether we're near or far. We all need to be fully drawn into God's presence. So this is maybe a moment to stop and ask another question. How are we helping others to come near to God? As Christian disciples, how can our lives and attitudes help others be drawn towards a relationship with Jesus? How as a community together can we be drawn closer, but also help others to recognize that they can be drawn near? And again, we can be critical of some of those divisive ideas that Paul and his Pharisee mates once had, but can we sometimes be guilty of the same if we're really honest with ourselves? Can we sometimes perceive of people who are different to us, people of different backgrounds, different lifestyles, different races and cultures, as somehow being outside or less central to the boundaries and possibilities of God's love and grace? When we are in Christ, we recognize ourselves as no better, no more deserving, no more eligible to be part of God's family than anyone else is. But we recognize that it's absolutely possible. Not because of any single religious or ethnic social group is more deserving than any other, but because it's possible for everyone. So is this a moment to just stop and consider what we might have consciously or unconsciously thought, who we might have consciously or unconsciously excluded in our thinking? And that rather neatly brings us back to that original point about the practical impact of this, or at least the practical impact that's in focus in these particular verses. And it is one of peace and reconciliation. Yes, religion, when misused and misunderstood, can divide people. But if we refocus on what it truly means to be in Christ, it's not a matter of simply moving from one divided camp to another, but having a whole new understanding of who we are. That's what makes Paul's journey so interesting, because his faith in Christ, firstly, doesn't cause him to see himself as different to everyone else, but the same. We're all in the same boat, he said. We've all messed up. When writing a letter to another church in Rome, he expresses it this way: we've all sinned and fallen short of God's glory. And again, he's including himself in that. You can check it out in Romans chapter 3 and verse 23. And the profound truth that he's discovered through his own encounters with Jesus is that this being messed up doesn't need to divide us from God. It doesn't need to divide us from each other. The whole of humanity is in need of God's grace, and the whole of humanity can find God's grace and come together as the people of God. Yes, we may have different ways of expressing that. We may sing God's praises in different languages and live out our faith in different cultures, but we can and are one. Not because of our superiority, but because of our common need of God's salvation. And the benefits of that salvation are so great that they eclipse any of those issues that might otherwise divide us. That's why the opening chapter is so important. You know, if we truly believe that we can be seated with Christ in the heavenly realms, then what's the point of falling out over our earthly realms? And that's a question that we could ask of almost any of those great declarations of God's grace and generosity that's been lavished upon us that we read of in the opening chapter. Yes, we can't avoid the reality that for many in our world, religion is still seen as a source of division. And I don't pretend that there's any quick or easy answer to this one. But maybe we could just pause as we kind of bring things to a close and ask, how do we get Paul's message across in our world today? How can we help everyone understand that they have a place in God's family? How do we at least demonstrate in our own life as a community of God that unity, that refusal to be defined by age-old divisions that Paul is so keen for us to set aside as we embrace our identity in Christ, the Christ who has broken down the walls of hostility, who draws those who are near and those who are far into the centre of his love and grace. Now, I'm not pretending for a moment that we can overcome every barrier and misunderstanding. But what steps could we take in embracing that reality more fully? That's something I'd invite you to ponder on. How can we show the world the difference between a merely religious community and a community that is truly centred in Christ, that defies and undermines every division that this world seems so capable of nurturing and maintaining? And whatever answer you do or don't manage to come up with, remember that whatever you may or may not have once been, you belong. You are reconciled with God. You are reconciled with others. And whatever divisions this world might have persuaded you that exist, Christ has broken them down through what he did on the cross.